Welcome to another episode of the Property Trio, the podcast for the sophisticated property buyer. I'm your host, Dave Johnston, and I'm joined, as always, by the brilliant Cate and the data hound himself, Mike Mortlock. How are you both?
Good, I'm loving this. Mike scripted it.
He's got a new nickname, the data
You're
hound.
so funny, Mike.
I'm a dog. Yeah, I don't even. I can't even claim credit for that. That intro was inspired by ChatGPT. Obviously, I kind of went through and tweaked it, but I was like, oh yeah, whatever. If that's what it wants to call me.
ChatGPT knows you too well.
Yeah.
So Mike's been knee deep again in data. This time it's in development approvals, which has been rumbling through for weeks, and he's emerged with a set of numbers that might shock you. Today we're tackling one of the biggest blind spots in Australia's housing conversation: the suburbs where supply just isn't showing up, and what that means for the rest of us.
Yeah, cheers, David. This was a pretty big project because we're looking at nationally every particular location around the country, and we wanted to shine a spotlight on the suburbs that weren't really contributing to new housing supply. Now, there's a million different reasons why that can be a legitimate thing and why there are actually barriers in place, and we'll unpack some of that today. But we took the latest census dwelling counts, so 2021 dwelling counts, and compared them with all residential building approvals over a 2-year period, so ending January 2024. So then we looked at statistical area 2 locations, which are broadly kind of equate to suburbs, and we looked at areas that had less than 1% growth in their housing stock, and 1% is incredibly low, especially when you consider we've added hundreds of thousands of new residents in that time. So these suburbs we've identified as essentially frozen from a new dwelling supply point of view. We filtered out areas with high proportions of units. So these are areas that we would kind of characterize as already heavily developed, because that could really also skew the data from a CBD suburb point of view. And we focused on the areas with more than 1,500 homes just to get away from some of the messy data problems as well.
Yeah, it's a great topic to have researched, Mike. Finding out the suburbs that just aren't building new property it's really interesting. So well done for coming up with it and doing the analysis. So we're talking about hundreds of suburbs around the country you've shared with us that have added virtually no stock over 2 years. That's a huge deal, especially when you overlay, as you've just touched on, population growth and all the new migrants coming to Australia.
Yeah, and I think migration is different to general population growth because I think it has a higher demand for housing, right? Because an increase in population can just be babies, and typically they don't rent apartments by themselves. But another caveat that I want to sort of chuck on here is we're not even talking about completion. So we're talking about the dwelling commencement, so really just approvals. And we know from experience that not every approval actually gets built, especially in the environment we're in at the moment. So the actual increase in available homes is even lower. I wanted to take a moment to talk about kind of the media influence in this story as well, because this research got picked up nationally. A number of different newspapers went different directions. One particular journalist was like, okay, so if you're an investor or you hate development, this is actually a roadmap to where you should go, where they're not going to build new stuff. And I'm like, yeah, that wasn't the intention of the research, but sure, if you want to do it that way. Other journalists were like, oh, so this is about like Karens not wanting development in their backyard. And I'm like, yeah, I guess there is a NIMBY aspect to it. And it ended up becoming sort of like the NIMBY lists, the biggest offending suburbs. And it was featured on Channel 7. And they even said, Mike Mortlock's MCG quantity surveys points the finger at this council and this council. I'm like, whoa, I wasn't really pointing the finger at anybody, because there are legitimate reasons why certain areas are kind of constrained with development that's kind of out of the control of the local homeowners. But the media is what it is. And I was actually most looking forward to sharing this research here because we'll pull it apart and, we're more interested in the truth than clicks.
I love it. And, let's not forget that people are at the heart of all of this. It's renters competing for too few homes. It's first home buyers being priced out, downsizers with, limited options as their lifestyle needs change. It's not just numbers, it's homes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's people's lives, isn't it? So
Yeah.
so let's so if we zoom out for a minute, the federal government's target, as we all know, it's been plastered over the media for some time, is 1.2 million homes over 5 years, which is around 60,000 new homes per quarter. But in quarter four of 2024, there were only 41,900 commencements. So that's a 30% shortfall. What are your thoughts on that, Mike?
Well, I think whenever this new housing accord or the press release of the 1.2 million homes, when that was started being communicated well in advance of when the target would actually start, and that started July last year, 2024. Interestingly, the politicians have sort of started to try and reframe it and go, from this July. I'm like, no. You've already had a year. For the year, the commencement sat at 168,000. So again, that's about 30% below that 240,000 a year that we need. I knew it was over before it began. It's a systemic issue. We're not keeping pace for a number of different reasons. So this research kind of, I suppose, goes into a little bit more detail onto some of the nuances why we aren't hitting that pace.
Yeah. So, and if we overlay that with demand, I mean, as we've already touched on, Australia's added another 650,000 people in 2023, and over 80% of that was net overseas migration. So we've got an influx of new residents and barely a trickle of new housing to support them. It's going to continue to be Australia's biggest issue when it comes to property, and that is the undersupply. We're just not building enough.
Yeah. And I think I've often sort of criticised people that talk about supply, especially when we're talking about the rental crisis, because the politicians only ever talk about supply as new dwellings, but supply of, say, rental accommodation can come from property investors. But this research, we're just talking about building new housing, and it's a fact that there's not enough housing coming to support the growth in population. And we're already behind the housing needs that we have as a country when you even remove the immigration. So it's a big problem.
Yeah, it sure is. And another layer is cost, isn't it? The government taxes and levies involved in bringing a new home to market are enormous, as much as 30 to 40% of the total cost.
Yeah, that comes from the HIA research paper that they put out. I think it was about a year ago. So there's a huge amount of impulse costs on new development. So things like GST, infrastructure levies, and developer contributions or Section 94 contributions, regulatory compliance. So if we're talking about a $750,000 new home, up to $300K of that could be tax and charges. That's a massive drag on supply, and something that I don't think many people talk about. If we're trying to get new supply, let's look at the impediments to new supply, and taxes and government levies are a big they're a big blocker in the way of it.
Yeah, so let's get this straight. The government, who are trying to increase supply and fix supply, are essentially the biggest problem with new supply because they're the biggest cost to building new homes. Yep. 30 to 40%. So,
yeah. And in the face of construction surcharges and, trade shortages, it doesn't make sense, does it?
No. So, Cate, I just want to bring you in here. One thing we know is that even where approvals could increase, they often don't, and they're of famous nowadays. Remember when people didn't know what this acronym meant about 15 years ago? But NIMBYism plays a big part. What can you share
Yes,
with us?
yeah, not
Yeah.
in my backyard.
Mm.
We see this a lot. It's often from residents who are otherwise very reasonable, and it's a combination of things. It's a fear of change. It's also a fear of value loss. A lot of us have our our greatest amount of wealth tied up in our family home. And if that's threatened, if change could suggest that the value of our house could decrease or crash, that will terrify a lot of people. So it isn't just change; it's fear of loss as well. And whether it's traffic, parking, loss of trees, simply not wanting a 3-story building next to your single-story streetscape, and even let's talk about the elephant in the room, social housing. And we've got affordable housing and social housing, at the tip of our politicians' tongues. And so many people think, yeah, that's a great idea. Is it okay if it's next door to you? So, some of these questions are really hard ones to answer, but fear is a really big driver for NIMBYism. And VCAT in Victoria, just as a local example, is absolutely clogged with appeals and planning disputes. And even when the councils try to support housing, their hands are pretty tied by very loud and active resident groups.
It's funny, like most people will say, yeah, we want more affordable housing. But then when you sort of say, oh, there's a site across the road from yours, they're like, oh, no, that's not a good area for new people to live. They'd
Yes.
much more like it out further out west.
Yeah,
There is a bit of self-interest there. Every time
totally.
I put one of these research projects together, especially if it has a national focus, I throw the Victorian stuff in your direction, Cate, because you know the area a lot better than me. But I wanted to share some of the Victorian suburbs that show the least housing stock growth over the past 2 years. They're
Mm,
prime, well-located, high amenity suburbs, but they're fairly well locked down. So I want to share
yeah.
6 of them. I've got Park Orchards, Balwyn North, Glen Waverley East, Mount Eliza, Camberwell North, and Blackburn. What can you tell
Yes.
us about these areas?
Some of them, well, what they've all got in common is that they're reasonably expensive suburbs. Glen Waverley East is probably the one that I'd circle in on and say it's the anomaly, because Glen Waverley East doesn't actually have. It's not a suburb on its own. It's a part of Glen Waverley, but it doesn't have a lot of housing anyway, and it's because it's the area within Glen Waverley that on the eastern side where the Dandenong Creek flows. So it includes attractions like the Bushy Park wetlands, Napier Park, the Dandenong Creek Trail. When you've got terrain like that and you've got water, you'll have water related overlays, and you'll have limitations on what can be built. Same sort of goes for bushfire management overlays, and we'll talk about that later. But I wouldn't have earmarked that as a suitable place for high density development anyway. And we're very quick to rubbish the town planners when they do approve high density dwellings in areas that are flood prone or what have you. I mean, just think about Kensington Banks in Victoria and the mess that we had with the 2022 floods and the areas now that are impacted by overlays that are water related. But back to the question, Park Orchards, Balwyn North, Mount Eliza, Camberwell North, and Blackburn. A lot of these areas have single dwelling covenants. So Park Orchards has bigger blocks as well, and that's historically how that suburb is rolled. You've got some really beautiful, 70s and 80s split level mud brick. It's a very leafy, gorgeous area where
Large
people
plots of
really
land.
enjoy those
Yeah,
bigger blocks.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah. They don't
Um,
choose to live there for a reason.
that's right.
Park Orchards, you're happy to go a bit further out because you get bigger blocks and more space.
Mm,
And each of these suburbs, they're leafy suburbs, they're east or southeast, and they have a high percentage of owner occupiers.
yeah.
So none of them are really surprising to end up on this list, are they?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, Mount Eliza and Park Orchards have a bit in common. You get leafy, gum tree blocks and semi acreage, but Balwyn North, certainly Camberwell and Blackburn No, those areas have good amenity. I'd argue that Camberwell and Blackburn have better amenity than Balwyn North, which doesn't have rail. Um, and as we know, we've seen some planning activity on the cards for Camberwell around the junction that the locals have been pretty upset about, our activity centre updates. And these are areas that could have higher density development, but you tend to see redevelopment more than subdivision activity. And I would argue that a lot of that is NIMBYism.
Yeah, exactly. And each of those three suburbs are sought after. They're tightly held. Their families move into there to be near certain schools. Certainly in Bourne and Blackburn, within the public high school zoning, and also the primary school in Blackburn is highly sought after.
Yeah.
Camberwell, we know there's Camberwell High School, which is also highly sought after, and then a lot of the higher end private schools. So people really hold on tightly to their homes in these locations, and then you certainly see a lot of NIMBYism. And I'm in Hawthorn East, just right on the cusp of Camberwell, and play cricket in Balwyn. My cricket club's North Balwyn, so know these areas quite well.
So you're saying it's your fault, Dave?
So it's my neighbour's fault.
Right. Yeah, and when we're talking,
I understand why they've come up on these. And look, as Cate's alluded to, Park Orchards and Mount Eliza, people live there for lifestyle, and they don't want that lifestyle being changed.
That's why there's character overlays to prevent subdivision activity eroding what's really precious about those suburbs. And it's fair to say that they're not high amenity areas for public transport links, and that's not the only thing that you're looking for in a suburb, but it's pretty important. You'd be less likely to see high density development and town planning approvals for activity type centres in an area that's not supported by PT.
And we're not even really necessarily talking about high density, we're just talking about higher density. So if these are leafy areas with big blocks, there's an opportunity to put, say, 3 or 4 townhouses there, so it doesn't necessarily have to be, a 10-story development, which really ruins the streetscape. But I'm guessing that because these are big block, leafy suburbs, split level homes, it's not going to fit with the streetscape to put duplexes or townhouses in there, and so there would be some community resistance.
I think vegetation and trees is a really big one. We can't underestimate the importance of that and the focus of town planners on arborist activity. There's a lot of development is precluded because of trees and just vegetation.
Yeah. And look, Waverley also is highly sought after for the local public secondary college. And you've got people who feel like, they've worked very hard to, buy houses in these locations, and they're pretty protective of these locations as well. So, that none of them are a surprise, to be honest. So we're in this position where a lack of supply is pushing up prices, pushing renters further out, and straining infrastructure elsewhere.
It does really have real world consequences. It doesn't just show up in the graph, or the spreadsheet or the research. It shows up in rental queues and families that are forced to move away from jobs for affordability, and in younger people getting locked out of certain parts of the market entirely. So it is, it's a big story, and it's a story that's been quite popular in the lead up to the election. Labor was the government that set that 1.2 million target. They've now got a majority in the lower house. I think there's probably still a few days to go before the Senate settles, but it sort of seems like all they really need to legislate is the support of the Greens, and things should sail through. So it's interesting. It's an interesting time to see what will happen.
Yeah, it sure is. I consider the inequality issue out of all of this. The people who already own in these suburbs are benefiting from that scarcity. Prices rise. Meanwhile, the new buyers and renters are locked out. So, you know, we do have to question the fairness of some of these policies and some of the areas that really preclude subdivision activity.
Yeah.
So let's talk solutions. What do we think needs to happen to shift this?
Look, I think there's no real panacea, and NIMBYism is one issue. It's probably overrepresented even in this research because it's the title of the research. But again, that's a bit more of a media influence. So that's one thing which we've talked about. I think planning reform is really, really important, and the speed and the complexity of approvals can be improved. We can definitely speed them up. We can simplify approvals. I think we can expand the realm of complying developments that don't need a detailed DA so that we can get things fast-tracked onto the market. Tax reform, we talked about reducing the upfront burden on new supply. I think we need a lot more skilled migration and training from the construction side of things. We need a lot more apprenticeships. I think Labor went to the election with some policies about rebates for people hiring apprentices. I think apprentices got a $10,000 bonus for tools and training and that sort of thing. Probably didn't go far enough, but we do need to continue to invest there. Public-private partnerships to deliver social and build-to-rent housing, and another opportunity that we can look into. And I think also just a bit of a cultural shift around development. We need to start seeing density as opportunity, not a threat. I think we've got to sort of contrast the great Australian dream as well and have a bit of an introspective think about what we want as a nation. We are kind of famous for that picket fence and the yard and the cricket pitch sort of thing. Most people don't cover the high density stuff, but it comes at an economic and environmental cost with things like embodied carbon in the way that we've traditionally lived. So I think it's about time we have a conversation about what we actually, you know, the way that we want to live and what's most sustainable and what's going to help our society flourish.
Yeah, you've pulled up so many good points, Mike, and I've got a couple of extras. You know, a really obvious one when you talked about cultural shift. What I don't think our governments have done particularly well in the recent past is consultation, community consultation, not just putting a diorama up on Swanston Street and inviting people to come in and see what something's going to look like, but actually engaging with the community and taking into account people's fears and having a process and a design that really speaks to that. And on that topic, design itself, you know, high density doesn't have to mean poor quality.
No.
A lot of us associate high density dwellings, you know, as dwellings that are not likely to withstand the test of time and either age quickly or start to fall apart. And we can have beautiful and well integrated townhomes and apartments if we get it right, but we need councils to allow it, and we need to have the communities on board. I think the biggest one though comes down to cost, because we've got to make this feasible for developers, because they're not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. It's not an altruistic thing that any developer would jump on board. It has to make money for them. And so we have to have a look at how that works, how financing works, how taxes work, and find a way to have developers who won't go broke get on board and build more housing.
I think so far we've only really seen the innovation in that side of things from the build to rent sector. Like the government provides, you know, higher rates of depreciation and things like that. But it's only those big conglomerates that are doing that, the build to rent stuff. And we've talked about this in the podcast before. You know, do we want our landlords to be corporations, or do we want them to be, you know, individual investors? I think we kind of all agree that corporations aren't necessarily going to be the best landlords, but we need more incentives. And another thing that I think we need to investigate a lot more, and perhaps look at some research and development grants or just some rebates for different construction styles, modular construction styles.
I was about to say that.
Yeah, there's a number of different things that we can investigate, but it's basically a matter of who's paying for it. You know, the developers will go where the incentives are, where the barriers aren't, where the costs are less prohibitive. So we kind of need the government's help to open up these pathways, because there's a million things we can do a lot better and a lot faster.
We need to remove a lot of the red tape as well. There's so many, environmental requirements nowadays, and that's okay. And we do need to obviously transition to net zero, but the amount of you talk to a developer or a builder, and the delays brought about because of all the requirements that pertain to um, the environment, always needing to have double glazed windows or a 5-6 star rating on the house or every single apartment. This is adding a lot of time and cost. I mean,
Mm.
you look. I can't remember if I've said this on the podcast before, but when COVID hit in China, they put up a hospital the size of Westmead in 7 days. You know, we're taking on average, from the beginning of the planning to actually finishing the build, for a new home, that it's like 1 to 2 years for one home.
Mm.
It just, because we're so wealthy, we put so much red tape and expectation around the things we do to get them so perfect. But that's a luxury, and it takes up a lot of time. It takes up a lot of money, and until we sort of remove a lot of these things, these imposts, we're not going to be able to build property as fast as we need to.
Mm.
That's a reality. Modular is a really good one, Mike, as
Mm.
well. And it's something we used to do a little market update every episode, just one thing of the week, and which we probably could go back to. But one I saw, which I was going to share on the podcast about a month ago, is the CBA just starting to open up lending to modular homes. And
Right.
really, until you can get finance for modular homes, you're not going to have heaps of modular homes built. But I just feel like that might be one little of opening of the damn wall with regards to modular homes.
Yeah, and
How
it
does
might.
that work from a security point of view, though, Dave? Let's say you've got an approval to put a granny flat at the back of your house. Who holds the security? What security is there for the bank to hold who's financed the modular home?
Yeah, so the bank, so they'll still just do a valuation on the land
Hmm.
and the modular home that sits on it.
Yeah,
I'm pretty sure, I was going to share the specifics, but I'm pretty sure the lender policy has a restricted LVR, so it might be
yeah,
80%
yeah,
rather than going to 95 or 97.
yeah,
So the LVRs might be reduced, but at the end of the day, they're saying, the modular home plus the land, and they're putting a value on that. There'll only be certain approved builders of modular homes. I think from memory,
mm,
so you've got to have a certain level of quality, be ticked off by
yeah.
by the bank.
So they're either seeing the modular home itself as a value add to the existing block, or it's like an equity release and there's a third party guarantor.
No, just they're just saying it. The modular home plus the land is a
Yeah,
value just like any home plus the land,
yeah,
but obviously
yeah,
the modular one is more movable.
yeah,
And there's an opportunity to de-risk the CBA or any other lender in this space by the government, by perhaps issuing a guarantee that ensures the transport of the modular home, or insures against theft or damage, that sort of stuff. That's what I'm talking about. Innovative options for the government to kind of intervene to help solve this problem. There's so much more that we can do. But Cate, I wanted to ask you some legitimate extra reasons why supply is kind of constrained when we talk about things like flood zones, fire overlays, and sometimes like just geographical constraints.
mm. Yes, I read your report and I was intrigued because there are a number of heavy hitting suburbs that look like they're wearing the NIMBYism badge, but when we look a little bit further, most of them have a bushfire overlay impacting them. And what we do know about construction, especially in my home state, is when you're dealing with bushfire overlays, you've got you've got a change to your building regs, and so they might have what we call BAL rating or a fire zone rating, and that means that you're required to produce a product that, in the case of FZ, which I'm completely familiar with because I've tackled that myself, you might have to demonstrate that you've got a design that can withstand up to 60 minutes of high intensity fire licking its walls, and it will still survive. So to create that product, you're dealing with all kinds of non-flammable products. You haven't got timber there at all. You've got fire resistant cladding. You've got shutters on the property. It's a very different proposition, and it adds considerable build cost. It can double the cost of a project, and it can change the design markedly as well because you've got less windows, etc. So, I'm very cognizant of the fact that any of the building elements that are altered by a bushfire overlay or a bushfire zone will probably deem a project untenable. So even if you own land and you wanted to build something with those kinds of overlays, you'd probably look at the costings and say, you know what, don't worry about it. So I don't blame NIMBYism on that. I actually circle in on planning requirements and build cost.
Yeah, that's what it does. It just increases the build costs, right? Because none of these things are
Massively.
stuff that the homeowner would necessarily want themselves, like a big water tank or a fire hose reel. These are just things that are put in place. And again, an opportunity for governments to invest in research and development for fire-resistant materials. It's a shame asbestos went wrong. That was a wonder material for a long time until it killed everybody that touched it.
I just looked up with the prefab lending. So CBA will lend customers up to 60% of the total contract price and up to 80% when they use a bank accredited manufacturer. So the LVRs are a little bit lower. And this is before the home is affixed to the land, as I spoke about. So rather than requiring them to pay for up to 90% of the upfront costs, as it has been done in the past. Yeah. So we need innovative solutions like those, don't we? We need government to cut the red tape and work with councils, work with local government to make it easier to build homes. We still want them safe, but we probably, can reduce taxes and make it easier for developers to make a profit. So thanks, Mike. This has been great research and highlights how deep the problem runs. It's not just a policy issue, it's a values issue. The question is, what kind of housing future do we want?
You're right, Dave. Housing's infrastructure, it deserves the same urgency as roads and hospitals and schools. And right now we're really failing to treat it that way. And we've just really talked at one lever, and that is the new supply. But I read something yesterday that said there's somewhere just shy of 60,000 sort of pensioners that are living in big homes that want to downsize but aren't because they're afraid about how that will impact their pensions in the future. So it's not just one issue, and the supply, as we've shared, is not just NIMBYism, it's not just taxes, it's a concert of things. But there's a lot of work to do if we do want to make some meaningful change in the space.
Yeah, well said. I think we need leadership, courage, and a whole lot more collaboration between government, developers, and communities.
Yeah, and I actually was out to dinner with a dad from our boys playing the same basketball team last night. He works for a major developer. He's considered going out on his own, and he's saying, look, the margins are less than 10%, and there's so many steps in the process. If something goes wrong, why would you even put yourself at the risk of being a self-employed developer with such small margins? And I think that speaks to a lot of what we've talked about today. So that's it for the episode. Thanks, Mike, for the data dive, and Cate for the great insights as always. If you found this valuable, please share it with someone in your circle who's passionate about fixing housing or would just like to become a better educated property buyer or investor or mortgage strategist or money managers, please share our podcast with them. We'll also link to Mike's research in the show notes, which you can have a good deeper dive into. But don't go away just yet. Coming up next are our gold nuggets.
Now it's time for us to go mining for our gold nugget property tip of the day.
My gold nugget for anyone who is feeling a little bit of a pinch of NIMBYism or is a bit worried about something is to source the information. In a lot of cases, there's good information there. It's just not always at our fingertips or in our faces. And you can jump onto local council websites to glean a lot more about the planning and the approval process and also the detail of the project itself.
Mine, I think I'd like to use one of Cate's comments as a jumping off point. She talked about community consultation. It's a multifaceted issue and there's a million different levers that we can pull that help supply. I think the rental legislation is one of them. I think the continual discussions about CGT changes and negative gearing changes remove certainty for investors that provide rental accommodation. I think we need to have some conversations about international migration and the types of people that are coming in and their areas of specialisation. I think there's lots that we can talk about organisations like the CFMEU and when they are forced for blocking certain developments or becoming an impediment to development. So really, politicians need to take advantage of the bright minds that we have in all of these areas and set an action plan together rather than just coming and doing a press release saying we're going to build 1.2 million homes when the government is not a construction company. They actually require developers to do that. And developers are the ones that are facing the taxes and the uncertainty and the low margins and the trades shortages. There's a lot of different parts to this. We can't focus on just one. We can't just win this with catchphrases. We need pure community consultations. We need an action plan. And if we care about the future of housing in Australia, we need to do it soon.
Yeah, well said. I think government of all persuasions and levels need to look at the taxes they're making from new property and where they can reduce those to make it more profitable and incentivise more properties to be built. I think we need to look at areas where we can reduce the red tape with the process of building a home and not have to jump through as many hoops. We still want our properties to be safe and we want them to be relatively environmentally friendly, but I think there's room for improvement of 10 to 20% there, which can allow us to build properties faster. And then I think they need to work with councils to make it easier. I mean, even with our renovation, like one of the biggest things that's holding things up is the plans for a drain with the drainage specialist at the council. Like, this stuff shouldn't be holding up renovations and home builds, etc. So I think a lot can be done without even needing a lot of the consultation necessary with the community because we can speed things up and make them cost less.
Excellent point.
And on that note, and also the irony is if you want to buy a really good quality property, you want to buy in places where it's hard to provide supply because it's going to push up land value. So that's a real irony for our listeners who are looking to make money from investing. But look, on that note, thanks very much, Mike. It's great research. Thanks very much, Cate. Brilliant insights as always, and look forward to our episode next week.
Yeah, same. Thanks, Dave.
Cheers.